Hello everybody. This lecture is designed for you as an introduction to various literacy programs and approaches that you might take in your elementary, K-6 classroom. Teaching reading and writing practices. Actually, some of these are really great even in high school, I would say. So let's look at them. It's an introduction, so for those of you who have advanced knowledge, this is all very low-level stuff, but here we go. Okay, a little brief history of trends in educational thought, first of all. There are these broad, sweeping historical trends in education. Through the 1960s and 70s, we had kind of a focus on skills, right? Grammar, decoding, and drills. The code emphasis here was better than a meaning emphasis, people thought. The meaning of what you were doing was less important than just learning the basic skills. Now, actually, when you get into a traditional learning school, a TLC, or a lot of charter schools emphasize back to basics things. That is kind of a byproduct of suspicions that the concern with meaning screwed everything up. That kids have gotten soft, that they've never been taught adequately the basic skills, and there's this drive back to the way it was done when I was a boy. So there's that. That is a traditional 1960s, 1970s kind of a model where you acquire skills via direct instruction, right? Teacher at the front of the classroom, wah, 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 and then drills, like drills and drills and drills. We call that drill and kill. So, this sort of stuff, it has its place, but not all the time, every channel, right? Phonics orientations, sounding things out, right? With reading, anthologies, and grammar textbooks. Real rigid control of vocabulary. The teacher or the basal reader decides what's important. You don't decide as a student what's important. It's very top-down stuff. So then, from the 1970s to the 1990s, we had what's called whole language learning, or authentic texts and meaning making. So here we had more concern with having authentic books and reading, not these see Dick run or see whatever spot or whatever, not these kind of exercise-driven textbooks, that are all leveled according to, expert ideas about what this and that are, but actual real books that, have a kind of a meaning, that are genuine books. Teachers would take more decision-making power here on too, right? It wouldn't be left to the people who made the basal reader, or the people who made that particular system, or larger concerns like that. It would be more, these are the things I'd like to do in my classroom. I went out to the public library and I found these interesting things and I brought them into my classroom, and I think the kids would find these meaningful, right? Less control of vocabulary too. It's more about, there's different kinds of vocabulary that just occur in these authentic books, and sometimes the kids will be interested in this word, and sometimes they'll be interested in that word. So it's a lot more holistic that way. Not teaching skills to be added up later. There's a focus here on meaning and accessing the 4 cueing systems, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, as well as drawing upon your own experiences as a learner. Very, very important stuff. You can see that in many ways, 1 and 2 here in this list are quite opposites of one another, right? Number 3, then we have this thing called a balanced approach, which ostensibly lasted through the mid-90s or to the 2000s. You can find lots of YouTube clips on the balanced approach to literacy development. Have a look at those and see what you can learn there. But generally, what you have here is the idea that, the one is one extreme, the other one's the other extreme, so we want to put the two things together and find a middle ground, right? That's kind of like the sane place, the sane middle ground, and that's what people were trying to hit for 10 years plus there. Whole language, in other words, was blamed for decreasing test scores, right? So then they said, well, we have to go back and combine whole language with phonics in some fashion. But then after that, and since the 2010s, we've had this idea, prescriptive reading programs and materials, right? Connections to scientifically based reading research. Everything now is research-based education, right? Like, it's almost like you can't do anything in your classroom unless some expert somewhere has tested it and verified that it works. And that's the new modality in education, is that everything has to be research-based. So a lot of that has to do then with, obviously, if it's research-based and it's been tested, then you have all these commercially produced reading programs that are a response to continued failure and test scores, right? It's a money-making machine that drives this research-based approach. But this is, who's going to argue and say, I don't want a research-based approach in my classroom? You can look like an idiot, right? Or you look like, I don't know. So it's really hard to fight the power on this one, folks, but in some ways this new mode is kind of it smells of being suspicious of teachers, thinking we're a bunch of dunderheads, and almost taking certain power away from us and putting it in the hands of people somewhere who are so-called experts, and holding us more accountable to tried, tested, and true systems, right? So if your principal brings in a new tried, tested, and true system that's, been researched and all this stuff, it's really hard for you as a teacher in this new environment to go against that. Okay, so commercially produced reading programs, a distrust of teachers, a call for scientifically based research, reading programs that provide little flexibility for instruction. Some schools, I won't mention any names, I've heard certain charter schools actually, I don't know if they still do, but they actually had scripts that they had the teachers follow. If you didn't follow the script, you'd get canned, right? Use of explicit and systematic phonics instruction, these sorts of things. So those are just a few different ways of, historical ways. Here's a few different approaches to organizing literacy teaching in your classroom. There is the Basal reader approach. Now, I'm not saying this is horrible. It's the most familiar reading material, reading approach in the classroom. It has definite positives and benefits, but then there's some negatives too. So what is the Basal reader approach? Well, you have a comprehensive set of materials, say from K to 8, for readers. Includes readers like little books that are leveled readers. It contains like different stories or connected stories. There'll be, an anthology. There'll be workbooks that are already prefabricated for you, so that all the Bloomian taxonomic considerations are in there. There'll be, if it's checked and vetted by provincial authorities, it'll be related to all the outcomes and everything. You won't have to do squat, basically, designing. It's all prepackaged for you, right? It's commercially produced with a prescriptive approach. It has a skills model to it, right? So it's got a predetermined order for those skills in which they're supposed to follow, and it's kind of a program, and it has a certain, gives you a certain level of comfort that that if you follow this, you'll be covering your bases, right? It usually, there's one reading anthology per year, and they're divided into themes like maybe journeys or animals or heroes or traditions or something like that, and it'll be all leveled to match reading abilities in your classroom, right? So there'll be easier, mid-level stuff, and then harder stuff, more challenging things. There'll be extensions, right? There'll be kind of like, what's that called? Enrichment work in there too, things like that, right? To find out if a student can read at this or that level, the teacher just simply has him or her read that section aloud, right? And then there's different kinds of basals, right? There's literature-based basals that contain actually authentic stories, right, to work on in decoding and fluency. And then there's phonics-oriented things like Dick and Jane. And then, Basal curriculums can be used on their own or mixed with books, music, art outside the Basal reader. So, there's ways of departing from it too. It's one option that you have, right? And it might be really valuable for you when you're getting started out in your classroom, because you're going to be busy. You're going to be worried about, how do I design stuff? Maybe this is an approach that they use throughout your entire school. Maybe it'll be expected that you use the Basal reader approach at your school. If you're going to work there, you have to decide, am I willing to use this? Is this something that I would want to bring into my classroom? Components of the Basal Reading Program. Well, there's selection in grade level textbooks. So Basal readings are typically organized into thematic units that are normally designed to last between 4 to 6 weeks each. Everyone reads the same selections in the grade level text each week, and the teacher's guide provides suggestions about how to support struggling readers and ESL students or ELL students. Usually there's audio and video recordings included to lend assistance to students. So that's handy, right? Like, not everything you read in a classroom is necessarily going to be readable by this or that student. There's audio, video recordings for students who are strugglers, who need, a text read to them and these sorts of things. It's all in the Basal. How handy is that, right? Instruction and strategies and skills. Most textbooks include instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, high-frequency words, word identification skills, spelling, grammar, mechanics. And the package will also include comprehending, monitoring, evaluating, predicting, questioning, summarizing, and visualizing strategies. So they've done a lot of the legwork for you with regards to assessment, and not just this or that assessment all the time, like rich kinds of assessment, all based on, I guess, right, the best kind of research on what the best teachers and most effective strategies are, something like that, right? Workbook assignments. Students complete workbook pages before, during, and after reading each selection. So there's usually 10 to 12 pages of such questions accompanying each selection, right? It takes a while for those kids to get through all that stuff. How interesting would that be, right? Or is that just teaching kids that it's just slogging through school is work, it doesn't have much to do? I mean, that's a question I would have, right? Workbooks include lessons in writing, words, letters, sentences, matching, and graphic organizers. Many of these pages can be done independently or with a partner. Lots of work can be checked by students themselves, but some needs to be marked by the teacher. So it's all kind of mixed. It's pre-designed for you. Very handy stuff, folks. Independent reading opportunities, too. Most Basal programs include a collection of real and easy, on grade level yet challenging books for students to read after finishing each section. Okay, so these are some materials normally included in Basal packages here. You can see there's a big book, supplemental books, there's the actual textbook itself, workbooks, transparencies, right? I don't know if it's transparencies anymore, but back in my day, blackline masters. What are those? Those are like little sheets, like handouts that you can use. You can photocopy them, make multiple copies for all the kids, or you can distribute them in the different learning centers that you've designed. If the Basal is designed to have learning centers at all, I don't know. There'll be kits, like, hands-on things that you can use, right? There'll be a teacher's guide. There'll be a parent materials, right? Multimedia, assessment materials. I imagine hearing about this too, you can feel your own anxiety about all the crap that you have to design as a teacher kind of reducing when you think about Basal packages, right? Oh, I got to get my hands on one of these, then I got it made in the shade. So, teaching with Basal materials, organizing daily activities, instruction, using anthologies and leveled texts. Well, the teachers using Basals often work with groups in 20 to 30-minute blocks. There's two different ways of approaching Basal reading programs. Typical strategies involve one reading anthology lesson and or a guided group reading lesson. All right, so there's different ways of approaching reading in a Basal unit of study. What's going on here? Come on, there we go. Reading anthology lesson plan strategies. Number 1, this is the first option, where you would activate prior knowledge and background experiences, so the teacher initiates discussion of a central idea or concepts in the story in the Basal reader. You try introducing unfamiliar words and how they're used in the story. The point is to form the link between the kids and the book that they start before they start reading, right? And then you provide a skill lesson. So you've got this first lesson on ideas and concepts. You provide a skill lesson. Try focusing on phonics or vocabulary sometime, or comprehension skills another time, to help prepare kids to read the story. And then you preview and predict, right? This is the next thing. Kids are often encouraged to look through a book or a story first. You do a picture walk or something like that, right? Have the students predict what they think will happen in the story just by looking at the pictures or the title. What does it tell them? And then they might use their own background knowledge as well. And then you read the actual selection with them. So these are the stages, right? In using a reading anthology out of a Basal. You read the selection. Teachers often have students read portions of the text either silently or in round-robin fashion. In primary grades, you can use this as an opportunity to assess word decoding strategies and fluency. You make some notes on how they're reading. And then confirming predictions, right? You already predicted what you think had happened. We read some. Did that happen? Didn't it happen? You confirm or you disconfirm. Is that a word, disconfirm? I don't know. You decide whether or not these things actually happen. And then you ask comprehension questions, right? Can the students find information in the text, right? Do they understand what happened? Comprehension questions too. I mean, I'm sure that in the Basal they're going to give you these things, but even on your own time, right? Like think in terms of your Bloom's taxonomy, right? Like simple, low-level factoid questions. Then you're going to be thinking about comprehension questions. Like can they summarize what happened? Application questions, analytic questions, synthetic questions, evaluative questions. Skill instruction and practice. Students practice strategies, right? Find the main idea in the book. Sequence the events in this book. Summarize what happens in this book, right? Different kinds of activities, practices. Lots of this work can be done with Basals using worksheets, right? They'll have these pre-designed worksheets and workbooks. And then enrichment projects. So if this is all easy peasy or lax engagement for some of the, more smarty pants or highly engaged students who want more engagement, then offer these enrichments, right, where they get to be creative and stuff. That's the idea behind a Basal anthology or a Basal reader approach. And then you can also use guided reading, right? So where you have number one, this is a second way to use Basal's guided reading group lessons. So here we have guided reading group lessons are an alternative structure to the reading anthology lesson. Unlike Basal reading groups where everything is normally set down in stone, right? The guided reading strategy changes to fit each group. So you use this strategy to get kids reading books that are perhaps too hard for them, for instance, to read on their own. So before the guided reading lesson, you select a text and you introduce the text, and then during the lesson, here's some bulleted comments by Flint in Flint's textbook as to what sorts of things you might do at each one of these stages before, during, and after. Probably many of you who are developing lesson plan templates right now, or filling out lesson plans and doing curriculum design in your classes, have a structure built directly into your lesson plan templates like this: before the lesson, during the lesson, and after the lesson. Right? So same sort of thing here. Guided reading group lessons continued here. When students aren't meeting with the teacher, they work independently at various literacy centers around the room. These centers are linked to the stories being read and focus on a variety of skills. You might have a word work center, a vocab center, a listening center, a comprehension center, a writing center. You can pause the slide and look at that on your own time. You see how this teacher here has actually color-coded the desks, right? So that different learning centers might occur at the yellow desk or the red desk or the green desk, right? Another example of using learning centers for fostering the writing process. Well, here we have a nice handy-dandy chart out of Tompkins' textbook on different centers that you might have if you're teaching the writing process. So we're teaching, for instance, revising or editing, right? Before this we have pre-writing and we have drafting, and then after this we'll have final copies and that sort of thing. But here are different things, to teach kids the importance of revising and editing. These things are different, right? Lots of kids, especially in high school, don't even know about the writing process, unfortunately. So here's some ways of scaffolding that, activities, getting them practicing writing processes in learning centers. Okay, so if you're doing reading or writing learning centers and you want to organize them, these are ways of organizing your learning centers. You can incorporate self and peer assessment forums that will help the kids stay on task while you're off helping other kids with strategies, monitoring, reading, conferencing, etc. Here's an assessment tool for a third grade editing checklist, right? You have the author check for these things, and then they have a buddy, and the buddy goes through as the editor, and they look for similar things, and they sign that they've looked for those things, and they check that they've looked for those things. See how that works? I have circled the words that might be misspelled. I have checked all the sentences beginning with capital letters. So editing, simple editing checklists, assessment tools. And, guided reading lesson groups, you'll find it helpful for both you and your students to make a chart of the weekly schedule for what each group will be doing. I think this is really handy. There's various ways of doing it, but you can see, if you're having rotations, you want to have rotation times that make sure everybody's flowing through the various centers. If you have them listed as A, B, C groups or whatever, maybe there's other ways that you want to call the groups or whatever. But then you use these, and then these become ways of organizing just to make sure that things run smoothly in your classroom. Because it can be very confusing, right? Very confusing for you, very confusing for them. It's nice to have it posted somewhere. You can use it to direct the students. There's an example, right? Some examples of real schedules teachers use in the classroom. You see how they've got it? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different stations there. And there's 5 groups of kids. And they're all roughly equivalent sizes, I think. Yeah, there's 4. Yeah, so mostly it's all four kids in each group, and they just rotate through. Probably the teacher gives 10 minutes at this group, 10 minutes at the next center, 10 minutes at the next center, something like that. There's another way to do centers, right? Instead of having a thing that you spin like that, you just have tongue depressors, right? And you put the names of the kids on the tongue depressors, or maybe they put a little face on there with their name and stuff. They make a little stick man, and it sticks in each one of the little library card pocket things, and they just move through. And they have to do so many a day, and they have to make sure that they try different ones. Here's another way where instead of doing that, teachers just made little hooks, right? Little hooks you'd get maybe at Walmart or Crappy Tire or something like that. You'd go there and get the hooks, and then you write the kid's name on them, and you'd stick the tags on there, and lots of organization. Teachers, it seems to me, are very good at organizing, especially in elementary. They're very, very good organizers, and lots of different ideas. I bet you'll find lots and lots of things like this on the internet that are much better even. Okay, there's another one, the idea of the wheel, and the kids' names on the wheel, and then they just rotate. And there's, more kids than there are, or there's less. Here we have there are less groups than there are stations, so there's one station that's empty. It'd be interesting to know how that works. And then your reading stations, right? There's another one. Examples of different groups, right? You've got Tyson tigers, sharks, rabbits, different names of the groups, and then they shuffle through depending on the pictures there. Each of the pictures means a different thing, and there's a different order to the centers for Thursday. Okay, so lots of good things to think about basals, but there are concerns that we have with basals too, right, folks? What are some of those concerns with this prescriptive approach? Well, it assumes that reading is a technical or series of component skills in a mechanical process. Is that how reading works? Is it kind of like a factory where you start with a small thing and you build it and you build it and you build it and you put all the stages together and then I've got a robot, I don't have a human. But, is that the way it works? Reading is more than decoding, isn't it? It involves critique and inquiry. So there's a danger that a basal approach might not allow for that. It might not foster that. And one size does not fit all. Basal readers and materials tend to hamstring teachers to a specific sequence of highly scripted programs. Again, some schools, not mentioning any names, but some schools in town here in Calgary, they, as far as I know, up until very recently, maybe they still do use scripts, right? If you deviate from the script, the hammer falls upon your face, or your head, or melon, or whatever. Lack of additional support or alternatives, right? So new teachers tend to worry about what they'll do in their classroom if they don't use Basal packages. So if everybody's using one and you're not using it, what am I going to do? You feel kind of like overwhelmed with the work that's involved. So create certain almost incentives, right, to buy into this package, this corporate package that everyone else is doing. There's peer pressure here, there's money, all sorts of things. Okay, so here's an overview of the instructional approach for Basal reading programs. There's the purpose, the components of it, the theory base behind it, the applications, its strengths, as well as its limitations. You can pause that slide and have a look at that slide and see if that's something that you agree with or disagree with, or at least you'll know walking into using a Basal reading program what it's good for and what it's not good for. So, are there alternatives to the Basal reading programs in your schools? Well, yes. There are teaching with literature focus units. I used to do literature focus units. What is that? Well, one alternative to Basal's is this literature focus unit featuring popular award-winning stories or informational books or poetry. Sometimes you might focus on a single book, maybe a picture book or a chapter book, or you might focus on several books in one sort of genre or by one author. Or even, like when I've done it in high school, it's often around a theme or a grand question. So teaching and learning in literature focus units takes the same basic 5-stage reading process form that pretty much every program uses. Number one, there's pre-reading, right? Teachers build background knowledge and interest in a book through introductions to the topic. Number two, reading. It can be done independently or shared, or both. And then 3, responding, class conversations, reading logs. Number 4, exploring, where you do vocab. You might have reading walls in your elementary classroom. Do word studies, comprehension strategies, research extensions. And number 5, applying, right? Students make projects or they compose things. Something that they do, something that they make, something that they share with everybody else and present. Something like that. So there's 5 basic stages no matter what program you've chosen or what particular approach, but here it is. Okay, 6 steps in developing a literature focus unit. If you wanted to do this, say you didn't want to do the Basal route, you want to try a lit focus unit, first you got to select the literature. So the main book you need in multiple copies, right? Also collect books related to the text, including maybe other versions of the same story, so like Cinderella stories or Prometheus or Stealing Fire stories, right? Collect all kinds of things that are related, and maybe sequels to that book or other books by the same author or in the same genre. See if you can collect 1 or 2 copies or maybe 10, 20, even 30 related books and put them in a special place in your classroom library. And then at the beginning of the unit, introduce the books and give the kids a chance during silent reading to read some of those other books. Don't forget to also collect things you'll need that are related to the exploration of the book, like puppets or stuffed animals, elementary, right? Or toys or charts, maybe diagrams, book boxes of materials, information about the authors, illustrators, big book versions for shared reading, DVDs, audio recordings of books, any good websites, right? A lot of legwork here on your part, but actually it can be quite fun, and you'll find all kinds of different things that you can bring in for your classroom. Rich learning around a particular author, a particular book, a particular question, a particular theme, something like that. And then you set goals. The next step is to set goals. Decide what you want your students to learn during the unit. All right? So you're thinking, well, in relation to the outcomes, right? What do I want my students to learn? And then third, you develop a unit plan. You should Read or reread the selected book and think about the focus you will develop for the unit. Example, maybe you'll focus on an element of story structure, its historical setting, maybe wordplay, maybe the author or the genre, maybe the topic of the book. Anyway, once you've settled on something, see if you can come up with activities that work at each of those 5 stages of the reading process. That is, pre-reading, reading, responding, exploring, and applying. And then 4, coordinate grouping patterns with activities. So, what's that? Well, think about how to incorporate whole class or small group and individual activities into your unit. Example, if the book will be read together as a class, then how can you give kids a chance to work, say with a buddy or rereading, or to read related books independently? Number 5, create a time schedule. This will help you stay sane, and it will lend organization to everything that the students are doing. So you set up your times so that the kids can move through all the 5 reading stages and complete the activities planned for the unit. And don't forget to include some time for mini lessons to teach reading and writing strategies and skills. Number 6, sometimes it's good to give kids unit folders in which they can keep all their work. Keeping everything together makes things easier both for you and for the children organizationally. Plus, you can use these folders as the basis for your assessments. You could, for instance, use checklists that the students keep in their folders and on which they check off items as they are completed. Another handy way to keep track of how much is being done during your unit is a status of the class board. All right, so there's an example of a status of the class board. So you can do something like that if you'd like. Well, where are the kids in pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing, and publishing? There's the writing processes they're teaching, right? So how are you doing there, Charles? Well, let's see, right? And if Charles is getting part way and maybe Bella's getting a little bit behind, maybe Charles can step back and maybe help with the editing or the revising or something like that, right? And they can help each other. Something like that, right? Here's an example unit plan, like a 4-week unit plan using literature focus unit strategy. So there's week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. You can see how it progresses. There's a scope and a sequence to this particular unit plan. You can pause it and have a look and see how they've structured it. Here's an overview of the instructional approach of literature focus units. Just like the one for the Basals, this one, it speaks to the purpose, the various components, the theory base behind it, its applications, its strengths, as well as its weaknesses. So again, it's good to know the positives and negatives of these different ways of approaching literacy learning in your classroom before you take them up. Okay, another way. Literature circles. So, when you ever been part of a book club? Similar thing, right? Except here it's not just one book club, it's a whole bunch of little book clubs in your classroom all at the same time. Maybe you'll have 4 or 5 different novels going on or something like that. But there'll be choice. The element of choice is in there, right? And then this group of kids will be studying this book, this one will be reading this book, and so on and so forth in other different groups. And then they get to talk about the books and explore those books among themselves, everybody that's reading that book. And then they get to present about that book and tell others in the other groups about their book, and they share and they learn from each other that way. It's a really good way of organizing, and one of the beauties of it is it gives kids choice in their learning, right? So one of the best ways to foster students' love of learning is to organize them into lit circles, in which they can talk about the books they've chosen with others reading the same book. Think of them as student-led book clubs in the classroom. Some key features of literature circles. You've got choice, right? So students pick a title from within a pool of books, and you'll have multiple copies of each, right? Maybe go to your school library and see what's available. Because not everything that you want maybe there's multiple copies of. You can also try to give them choice as to their role in the book group, as well as the choice in sorts of activities or inquiries in which they'll participate. So choice can be not just in the book, but in the activities and in roles and all that kind of stuff. Literature. The books you provide for them to choose ought to be of high interest and at their reading level. Personally, I like to have some longer books as well as some shorter ones, some fiction, some non-fiction, and various genres represented. You might have some informational books paired with these stories as extensions to readings. That's very true. And then group response or discussions, right? So students meet often in their groups every day, right, to meet and discuss the book. They have a chance during these things to summarize, make connections, learn vocab, talk about big ideas, problems, questions. And, when you get them together into groups and discussions, you have to somehow give them some guidance as how do we work together as a group? How do we do this as a group? So that will be something, too, that you'll have to train them how to do, is how do we work collaboratively? How do we get together? What are the sorts of things that we do in a book club or in a lit circle? And if you go to my old website, my old teaching website, Mr. Steele's class, you can find an example of lit circles if you go to the 20-1 section. Okay, types of talk during lit circles discussions. Well, there's talks about the book, talks about connections, talks about reading processes, and talks about group processes and social issues. All right, different things that you might have students talk about from day to day. Maybe you have them responsible to talk about each one of those things in different ways as they move through the lit circle process. You would offer them some kind of scaffold, some kind of guidance as to how you'd want that to look. But you can pause this slide and see what Gail Tompkins has to say about organizing for those different sorts of discussions about books. Roles student play in lit circles, right? So do you want to assign students roles so that they know what they should be doing when they sit down in a lit circle? Maybe you need a discussion director. Well, what should she do? Maybe a passage master. What does he do? What's a word wizard do? What's a connector do? A summarizer? Do they rotate through these roles? Is each person responsible to demonstrate that they've done each one of these things? Maybe you have a little stamp pad or something like that, or like here you have a role sheet, right, for the word wizard, and it gives some ideas about, well, this and this is what we need to look for, and then he writes down or she writes down the different words and their meanings and something like that, right? Implementing lit circles. Well, you have to select your books. So Tompkins recommends having 5 to 7 titles and 6 to 7 copies of each book. I think that sounds about right. Sometimes this is pretty unrealistic, like your school library doesn't often have that many options, and many schools are phasing, nice spelling there, Sean, phasing out real books in favor of going digital. That's true, and it's sad and it's pathetic, but it's very sad and pathetically true. Just do your best to provide lots of choice among books that the kids will probably like. Then you form the lit circles. Try not to let the groups be too big. That's very true. 7's probably pushing it. Probably 5. 5 is like some kind of magic number, I think. Getting past 5, too big, I would say. You can let kids set a schedule for what goes on, but personally, I like to set it myself so that I can make sure things stay on track. I think that's probably your better option, but it's up to you, right? Whatever level of freedom and fluidity you foster in your lit circles. It'll depend on the group and your abilities as a teacher, I suppose. Then you read the book, right? Students read all or part of the book independently or with a partner, depending on reading difficulty or availability of the text, right? If there's not enough text, then they might have to share. Afterwards, students prepare for discussion by doing the assignment that corresponds to whatever role they've assumed in the lit circle. And then, the next step, participate in discussions. They meet, talk about the book in their groups, usually about 30 minutes. I've done 20 minutes. Like in high school, I used to have my kids actually reading the book in class for 40 minutes and then talking about it for 20 minutes. I found that it's really important to let the kids read in class, because in high school you would think, oh, they're old enough, they'll read on their own. They totally won't read on their own. Some of them will. Lots of them won't even read the book. They'll just go on to Spark Notes, and they'll look up the chapter summaries, and they won't ever even read the book, right? So if you make them read the book in class, problem solved. But it's up to you. Teach mini lessons next, right? So teacher teaches mini lessons before or after meetings on various topics. So, for instance, you ask good questions, complete rule sheets, right? How do you ask good questions? You do a mini lesson on how to do that. You say, what is a good question? You give them an example of it. You model it, and then you let them practice it, right? That's the typical format of a mini lesson. What is this thing? How do I model it? Now you practice it. Or completing rule sheets, using comprehension strategies. These are all different kinds of mini lessons that might pertain during a lit circle, approach. And then sharing with the class, right? So groups and individuals share their book with other groups in book talks and presentations. Okay, so that's, again, lit circles. Here's the purpose, the components, the theory-based, the applications, the strengths, and the limitations of this particular approach to literacy in your classroom. You can pause that slide, have a look at it, see whether that sounds like something that'd be cool beans for you, or if maybe, not so much. Another one, reader-writer workshop approach. Well, this is a different one. So what is this? The principle behind the reader-writer workshop is that you learn by doing, all right? How do you learn to read? By doing. How do you learn to write? By doing. You set up kind of like an artist studio in a reader-writer workshop, where you learn art by doing art. How will you set up your learning environment? Well, you have a class library. That's essential. You make sure you have a wide range of books. That's essential. All sorts of topics, authors, genres, levels of difficulty, lots of text on the walls, reading corners, maybe a book nook or something like that, writing tables, place for inquiry, drama, play centers, right? You can create connections across the curriculum with science and math and social studies, etc. The interdisciplinary studies, right? And then 3 basic components here. You need a writing center, a reading center, and a classroom library. Those are the 3 basic components for a reader-writer workshop. A writing center, a reading center, and a classroom library. Okay? Flexible reading groups. Do you want this, right? It used to be most common for students to be separated by reading ability into low, medium, and high groupings. That's how it was when I was a kid. I remember kind of feeling kind of like I was dumb when I was in the low group, right? And there was a certain stigma to that. It made me kind of feel this way or that way, but I know that that's the case for lots of kids. So the idea, people... the idea behind that was that I can, as a teacher, I can help the kids who are lower readers, or I can help them, I can tailor my lessons to them, or I can tailor my lessons to the medium, or I can tailor my lessons to the high groupings. This is still very, very popular in high schools. Not all high schools, thankfully, but some high schools, high achieving high schools love this kind of stuff, because then they can have an honors class, or an AP class, or, and then they pull those kids, they cream those kids out, and then that becomes kind of like a badge of honor for those kids, and it also makes the parents feel really good about themselves, like they're somehow more successful than other parents, right? And also the idea, pedagogically, is that if you run that class, you're going to teach those kids differently and at a different level than you would with medium or low kids, and they won't be dragged down into the morass of the hordes, right? I mean, that is a very bleak way of putting it, but that is... and maybe I'm being unfair to that. I know lots and lots of teachers really love that. They felt like it helped give them better opportunity to differentiate their learning, for abilities and inclinations and stuff. Me, I was more suspicious of it. I didn't really find it that helpful personally. But anyway, you might or you might not, right? So the point of this is, though, traditionally, we had low, medium, and high groupings for readings, and this made differentiated instruction. It didn't help struggling readers so much, right? So now it's common for teachers to try flexible reading groups. This method lets students of various abilities help one another, right? So you're not the only person that helps. They help each other. They learn community. They don't learn to divide each other according to abilities and IQs and the rest of this nonsense. They actually learn that they have to care about each other and help each other. So they can be grouped to work on this or that reading or strategy or skill. Or they might be grouped based on their common interests. Isn't that a wonderful way to, rather than ability, what about common interests? Isn't that a way cooler way of dividing kids? I would say yes. Anyway. Structuring a reader-writer workshop, how do you do this? Well, students work together independently, reading aloud and silently rather than doing drill sheets, okay? So much different than the Basals. You try to orchestrate a seamless transition between reading and writing activities. You establish routines and expectations to increase productivity. Workshops typically include mini lessons that focus on different strategies for reading and writing. Reading and response, right? So independent reading, shared reading, lit circles. Number 3, it'll include writing and response. So you have author circles, right? Editing work, authors' chairs. You'll have number 4, you'll have reading and writing conferences, and then you'll have sharing time. Okay, so those are some ideas about reading and writing workshops. There's lots on the internet about reading and writing workshops. My suggestion to do is just look on YouTube. You'll have some really great teachers demoing how that works in their own classroom. They'll be pleased as punch to, have you guys looking at their stuff. Mini lessons, you use these to discuss reading, writing strategies as well as to get students to decide on what their goals are. This is very important in reading, writing workshops. It's about handing over ownership to the kids. It's not direct instruction from you, the teacher, telling them, I'm going to tell you what you're going to read and what you're going to write and what your goals are going to be. No, I want you to tell me what your goals are. Well, I want to read more smoothly. I want to read harder books. I want to learn how to pick up books that are good for me, right? Students can fill out goal-setting sheets each week if you want. So you can find, mini lesson examples on the internet of periods. You can find mini lessons on genres of literature, all different. If you want to see how they run, just go on to YouTube and you'll find some good examples. Number 2, reading and responding, independent reading and literature discussion. So most of the time in a workshop is devoted to reading and responding. So it usually includes independent reading or sustained silent reading. That's SSR, right? Choice in reading and activities is key for students in workshops. You have to leave time for kids to read in your classroom. Lots of time for them to read, okay? Quiet time. Students also read texts selected for literature discussion groups and respond in literature response journals, using these journals to make connections between text to text, text to self, text to world, right? These are important connections for meaning. Because if they're not making these, then all they're doing is they're running through the mechanics of, they could just be machines, almost like you're training them just a whole bunch of skills that have no relation to any meaning in the world, right? So can you make connections between, when you read that book of mythology, can you make connections between that and, say, that Thor comic book that you just read, right? That's pretty cool. Or text to self, right? Well, what is it about Thor? Do you see elements of yourself in Thor, right? Or, text to world. Well, wow, when Thor was fighting against that dragon, does that remind you of anything that happens in the real world? Something like that, right? Students may meet in multiple groups at the same time, with the teacher circulating around the room. The teacher collects and files responses for future reference and assessment. Number 3, writing and responding. Some students can be in literature groups while others are writing. The intent here is that kids will move through the authoring cycle. So during this time, students will write about experiences, like what they know. They'll engage in uninterrupted reading and writing. They'll write to gain new perspectives, and they'll edit, and they'll self-reflect. So there's the authoring circle. You can see how it works. Maybe you could organize your classroom so that there's time for kids to move through each one of these one of these elements of the circle. Can you scaffold that? Can you create structures in your classroom that help the kids move through those different components of the authoring circle? Some examples from Tompkins of the variety of responses you'll likely want to cultivate in workshops? Well, you want to have immersion responses, involvement responses, and literary connections, right? Different patterns and the description of those patterns, right? So you can look at this chart on your own time and see how you might use the ideas that Tompkins offers nice and clearly here to organize your own reader-writer workshops. Okay, so some valuable components of reading and writing workshops. You're going to begin with the known, right? It's always important to start with what kids know. It helps avoid not having anything to write about. Write about what you know. Write about your own life. Tell me something of your own life and your own interests, right? Links to your own life. After collecting the ideas, the students pick one of those ideas to write about in a longer fashion, right? So pre-writing. And then author circles. 3 or 4 students share their less polished thinking and writing with each other. Tell each other stories, right? Providing feedback. Oh, I like this. I like that. What was this? What happened in your story? Oh, that character reminds me of this person and stuff, right? You can gain new perspectives. After the author circle, keep on drafting and editing and reflecting on writing. So working through writing processes. Get the kids doing it in pairs. Get them doing it in small groups. Scaffold it with different tools that you can offer the kids, maybe different stations in your classroom devoted to different components of the writing processes, that sort of thing. And then reading and writing conferences, right? This is important. You sit down individually with students, usually 2 or 3 students per day, using the results of these conferences for mini lessons. Usually you read both from a familiar text, like a self-selected text, and an unfamiliar text, like a teacher-selected text. And you can use the teacher-selected text to do what's called a miscue analysis, or running record. Now, if you want some good examples of miscue analysis, there's some excellent teacher-driven videos on YouTube that teach you how to do miscue analyses. Check those out. Another book I would strongly recommend is Mary Clay, Running Records. That's the one that very often is recommended in BEd programs where you want to learn how to do running records. So these are all about fluency, though, right? They're like to test fluency. It doesn't tell you anything about whether a kid understands what he or she's reading, but like comprehension-wise. But it will tell you, what level is students at, what sorts of mistakes he or she's making, what sorts of reading strategies he or she is using. If they're not using this strategy, you don't see them using this strategy, then you can recommend them trying this strategy, right? And then that may really help them. So it's a valuable strategy for assessment in your classroom. You could definitely benefit by looking up something on miscue analysis. Okay, some more valuable components for reading and writing workshops. A status of the class sheet. We talked about this earlier, right? This organizes the class to see what everyone ought to be doing in the workshops. You can have it every day or maybe just a couple times a week, something like that. Sharing at the end of each workshop provides time for students to share their work, right, with others. So here's all kinds of sharing in the writer's workshop here from kids and from people, what they've learned. 2-page summary of teaching structures here is offered by, I think this is Flint here, in reading and writing workshops. So there's a reading aloud and shared readings, different ideas that you might use for in when you're reading aloud or doing shared readings with students in a reading and writing workshop. And then mini lessons, literature discussions, independent reading and writing conferences. Okay, so you can pause this slide and have a look at that. But anyway, an overview of the instructional approach in a reading and writing workshop. You can see the strengths, the limitations of it, its theory base, these sorts of things. This might be really great. I think it's not all that common either that teachers run writers' workshops. it might be really good during such a writing workshop, even if you can find a local author to come in and talk to your students about writing. I've had a wonderful author, Rosemary Nixon, come in to talk to my students several times now. Really great. Nothing better than having an author come in to give authorly advice about how to do writing and engage in real, authentic writing, rather than the kind of teacher-driven, school-driven, curriculum-driven, outcome-driven writing that is very fabricated and inauthentic. Okay, so there's different ways to pace a workshop. Here's just an example, right, of, how much time, given, your literacy studies, are you going to allot to each component of your unit, right? Well, looks like the lion's share here is on independent and small group work, and then you've got 5 to 10 minutes with mini lessons, a certain amount with sharing, and a certain amount with mid-workshop interruptions and, time loss like that, something. So there's an idea of how you might structure. Here's another teacher's idea about how that might look. You can have a look at that. You can see it's slightly different. This is a 90-minute one. That's quite long. It might be before and after recess, right? Some examples from your Tompkins textbook on how to schedule reading and writing workshops at various grade levels, right? So there's the first grades, third grade, sixth grade, eighth grade, different time structures and schedules for reading and writing, varying depending on age. And some examples of wall posts that you could have, you could use to help organize workshops in your classroom, right? So when you're doing author's chair with kids, well, here's some guidelines about positive comments and appropriate suggestions. How do you do that? How do you, kids won't immediately know how to engage, so you have to provide them with some kind of direction, and you'll have to talk about how to do this and model it with them and give them a chance to practice it, and you observe and you give commentary and, on how they're doing and if they're engaging properly. You can use procedural notes like this to help not just the students, but you too, and visiting parents remember what is going on in all the busyness of your classroom, right? You wandering around, and you've already taught kids, right, how to engage in author's chair, in the author's chair activity, but, you're in this other group and you see them not doing it quite, and you say, let's look up there at the corner, look in the green sheet. Do you remember how to do a positive comment? There it is right there. Read that aloud, or read that to your neighbor, right? And then that allows you to have little reminders all around your classroom for, processes. And response groups, right? Here's a good example of simple instructions for response groups, right? Simple instructions. Okay, and lots of your wall posts will probably come from mini lessons, right? You've been teaching these kids, you've been having these mini lessons. You want to have the little items that you need them to remember to help them write big words. Here's the basic strategies that they can use. So I took this, I think I took this from Mrs. Meacham's website. You can find her website. But it has lots of helpful materials you can download to save time when you're trying to get your wall poster components together. So you can, click print and cut out workboard cards, for instance. There's lots of websites like this. Okay. Another good wall poster that teaches students good procedures for learning to read here, strategies to help us spell, right? These are things probably that you've talked about in, various mini lessons, and you're just keeping them and tallying them up, and there they are. You can use this as a visual to help them when they're reading, going around, or you're doing an individual conference. Look at number 3. Let's try that. Look at number 7. Let's try that. This wall post advises students to infer an unknown word from context, right? Decide from context. But what other kinds of inference drawing, apart from code breaking, might you try, right? So, if you're only doing code breaking, phonetic, sounding it out, what about these other ways, right? Try to get the kids to stretch beyond the literal level or simple summarizing. I find that in grade 9, when students come to me in grade 9, that's pretty much all they have ever practiced for some reason, right? I don't know, maybe there's some timidity around that in the grades prior, but it's a real struggle at the grade 9 level to get kids to start thinking, metaphorically or symbolically. So see if you can engage them in higher level thinking about metaphors and symbols. Another good example of a wall post designed to help students make connections between what they're reading in their own lives here. Connections, right? You're making text to self connections. Here's some guidelines. Here's some examples. Put them in your room. Put them up. Help the kids remember. And then when you're picking a book, right? How do I know if a book's too hard for me or too easy for me or just right? Well, use the 5-finger rule. What about letting the kids do some self-assessment to figure out what's too hard or too easy for them or just right for them, right? You've got your miscue analyses and your running records that you can do as a teacher. Those things are pretty onerous tasks, though. What about if the kids learn how to judge whether a book's right for them or not right for them? Probably better in the long run, right? Another one, what is a just right book, right? Here's some simple rules how you could run, just help kids decide what's a book just good for me. Remember, don't burn yourself out. You're not the only person in the room that can help kids. So get the kids to help each other, right? Here's a little list, a little chart that a teacher has put up in her classroom that gets the kids so that they look to each other for help, not just you, always standing there and coming up to you and asking you questions. Ask each other, help each other. Train the students to help each other. Teaching is a good way for students to learn, and helping someone else is rewarding too. Yes, so how to help your partner. Look at all the wall posts you can have in your classroom to help them remember. Lay down some good, easy-to-follow procedures for kids to follow so you don't have to micromanage every minute for every child. Teach them how to moderate and manage their own behavior by giving them some daily routines to follow. There are some daily routines right there. Just like your classroom helps everyone set up good routines for learning, you can use wall posts to teach children about good daily habits for reading as well. How do we become good readers? Here's what good readers do. One guy I really like, you'll find him on YouTube, Dr. Andrew Johnson. He's got a whole slew of really excellent YouTubes on literacy, on social studies, all kinds of good stuff. I would recommend looking at his stuff, honestly. Really accessible. He's a funny guy, too. He's got a little dog that's kind of weird. He dresses him up in superhero costumes and ballet things, and it was very bizarre, but nice guy. He offers a good overview, similar to Tompkins, of the 4 basic approaches to organizing literacy instruction, if you're interested. So there's, Basal literature-based approach, there's the language experience approach, reading workshop approach. You have all sorts of good ideas about various structures for learning, but whatever structure you choose, how do all the pieces fit together for a final goal? Say, the goal of writing a story or an essay. Here's one example of an order to all the organizational structures that might be good for a 4th grade classroom. We took this out of Tompkins, right? So, here's your pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing, and publishing process here, the writing process activities, right? Here's the different activities you can have when you want to structure and those processes and get kids practicing those processes. This is so important, guys. If you do this, by the time they get to high school, they won't suck nearly so badly as so many kids do, because they're just used to just writing something and saying, that's the end of it, I'm done. No. There's no writing processes that you've really learned to practice. They're going to learn these things from you guys in K-6. They're going to learn these things, how to do this with you, and here's some easy ways that you can structure right into, your centers, into learning stations, even to weekly processes that you want everybody to go through. And, maybe you even want to organize a kind of a checklist or a stamp pad or something like a learning passport that the kids have to demonstrate for you. But if you can do this with your kids, you will help them immeasurably with their writing. Okay. that's the end of that longer lecture on different approaches to literacy in your classroom. I hope it was helpful. Good luck. See you next time.